Hi there, my name is Chuck Rozanski, and I'm about to start presenting a series of videos in which I try to provide you with some education about Pueblo pottery, at least to the extent that I know it myself, and to also allow you to look at a lot of Pueblo pottery, because I have what I believe is the largest private collection in the world, and actually a collection at 10,000 pieces, which is larger than most of the collections that are in museums. I think the Smithsonian has a larger collection than mine, but theirs is mostly older material because they were blessed to get the George Gustav Hay collection of the Museum of the American Indian. They merged together. And so they ended up with a large number of very old pots. But in a very strange twist of fate, George Hay left the Museum of the American Indian and retired on March 11th, 1955, which was the day that I was born. And so the synchronicity of that seems odd. I didn't find out about it until about 6 months ago. But I have picked up Hay's mantle to the extent that I have tried through mostly public auction sites. I do a lot of buying on eBay. I do a lot of buying on other auction sites that I'm able to access. And then I do a lot of buying through galleries. I buy some things through creators themselves. But just in general, anywhere and any time that I can find Pueblo pottery of pretty much any variety or ilk, I buy them. So let's, like most good comic book stories, since I'm a comic book dealer for my day job, let's talk about the origin story. About 25 years ago, I started attending auctions that were being put on by my friends Bob and Dal Payne, and they're from the Four Corners area of New Mexico, down in Bloomfield. And they travel around to various cities such as Oklahoma City and Boulder/Niwot, and they put on Indian artifacts shows. And those artifact shows, they sell things like jewelry and rugs and art prints and potteries. And so I went initially to just try and find some turquoise jewelry for my wife as a gift. And then when I was there, I got enamored of some of the colorful pottery that they were offering up for sale. And I'm going to show you a particularly neat example of that right now. This is an etched piece of pottery that was basically done with a Dremel, but it's really beautifully decorated. It's got a little bit of dust on it, but generally this is a beautiful piece. But the thing to realize is, one, it's not Pueblo. It was made by folks that are Diné Navajo. Second of all, it's a cast piece. So in other words, this was made in a mold. It is just poured commercial clay that they then airbrushed and etched. And so it has very little to do with traditional Pueblo pottery. And as I participated in the auctions that the Paynes were putting on, I came to realize that there was real deal pottery, and then there was this stuff. And this is the kind of stuff that you're going to see when you go to most gift shops. They're going to try and hustle you into things that are not Pueblo pottery. And some of the things are still quite beautiful. I like this etch pot, and I still have it. I had about 10 others, and I sold those just because I didn't feel like they fit into the collection. But I wanted to have one around so that everyone could see how I got started and where my education began. So moving on from this, I started buying a few pieces of what are called Santa Clara blackware, and I really liked it. The silky smooth feel of the clay after it's been stone polished is remarkable, and that prompted me, at least in part because Bob and Dal Payne kept telling me to actually go to Santa Fe and to drive out to Santa Clara Pueblo. It was when I went to Santa Clara Pueblo that I went from house to house, because in those days, right now we're in the COVID epidemic, and so the Pueblo is closed. No outside visitors are allowed. But in those pre-COVID days, you could literally just go from house to house, and they'd have little signs out that said pottery for sale. And you could knock on the door and go in, and generally there'd be a coffee table with 5 or 6 or 10 pieces on it. And you could buy things directly from the people who made them, or from their spouses or relatives. And it was a really good thing to do. And in the course of doing that, on my very first visit, I met a lady by the name of Celestina Naranjo. And her house was right on the Central Plaza at Santa Clara, and she sold me a little bear. And that little bear is not this particular one, but it was one very, very like this one. And this was a bear by her son-in-law, Eloy Naranjo. And Eloy's bears are very, very interesting, to the extent that they are basically a ball of clay that has, a little snout, little ears, and it's all kind of just hand formed. But if you look kind of closely here, it's very smooth and very, very nice. There's also something else about Eloy's bears. Because of the way that they are constructed, they hold your body heat. And so if you hold them in your hand, and what I typically have done in the past is just to rub the bear between its ears, there's this strange sort of connectivity that occurs as your body heat warms up the energy that's in the bear itself. Now, this is a very important consideration, and that is that what I've learned in the interim, I didn't know this at the time, obviously, but what I've learned in the interim is that Pueblo pottery, first off, it's all hand built. It's not made out of a cast pot. Everything is clay that's dug generally on the Pueblo, and then sifted by hand and formed by hand, polished with a stone, and then fired typically in an arrangement in a backyard, which is a very, very primitive form of a kiln that does not generally involve any kind of electricity. It's fired with cottonwood bark, and in order to get the blackware that so many people are enamored of, there's a trick at the end of the firing where, at just the right point, they smother the fire with ground up horse manure generally. And that allows the pottery to then be imbued with the black that so many people are so fond of. This particular piece, it's got tan Santa Clara clay as the under clay, but then this red is traded from a nearby pueblo, a Carrizan pueblo down south of Santa Fe, called Santo Domingo, and for at least 100 years they have been the source for all the other pueblos of this beautiful red clay, which has a iron-based background, which is why it fires red. So, but this red clay also will fire black if it's smothered towards the end of the firing. In any event, when you're looking at Santa Clara clay, and you're looking at pieces of Santa Clara pottery, there's way more to it than just technical skill at working with clay and creating a ceramic. These are not ceramics. Ceramics would be fired much, much hotter, 3,000 degrees or so. A lot of times Santa Clara pieces are fired at 12 to 1,500 degrees. That makes them very water soluble. So one of the first things that you learn about Santa Clara pots is no matter how good that base might look with flowers in it, don't be fooled and put water in your Santa Clara pot, because you'll come the next morning and you'll have a pile of mud because it isn't stabilized. But if you treat your Santa Clara clay nicely, it's gonna stay with you forever. And even now, just as we've been speaking, this little bear has been warming up. Now, for most people, that's not a big deal, but for me, 25 years ago, I started feeling like I really wanted to meet the creator of this bear. You can ascribe that to whatever you want. I don't care. Okay? But I was sitting there watching Sunday Night Football after my trip to Santa Fe, drove all the way back to Boulder. I got in my car the next morning and drove all the way back down to Santa Fe, drove up north then to Espanola, which is where the Santa Clara Pueblo is, right along the Rio Grande River. And I knocked on the door again, and this time I got to meet Eloy, the man who had made this. And that was such amazing synchronicity, because Eloy then became my kind of guide and teacher. He and I hit it off from the very first moment, and I suddenly realized that I was into something that was way different than what I imagined. And bear this in mind, I'm a collectibles dealer. I've bought and sold comic books since 1968. And so I've had all kinds of porcelain statues, and I've had original artwork by some of the greatest comics creators that have ever been in the world. I've been good friends with people like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Will Eisner and Julie Schwartz. I mean, all the giants of comic book legend and lore have been my friends. But nothing within that context ever affected me the way that Eloy's bears did, and the way that I started feeling a really strong sense of kinship with the people at Santa Clara Pueblo. So, first I went down, met Eloy. I ended up buying a couple more pieces from him, as I recall, and made a date to go back down there again and take my wife, Nanette. And long story short, we became very good friends with Eloy and his wife Millie. So this was a relationship that was bonded as a result of my having bought just one bear. So having bought a bear, that's all well and good. Having established a kinship with Santa Clara and feeling a kinship with the Santa Clara people is another thing. But where do you go from there? Well, I'm kind of a scholar / historian. So the first thing that I started to do, and what I would encourage you to do if you're interested in learning about Pueblo pottery, is to read. And I have brought, for show and tell, a couple of my favorite books and what I think would be most educational for you. This is a stack of books, most of which are out of print, and you can find them fairly readily on eBay or on ABE Books, and they're not expensive as a general rule. This is, to my way of thinking, the best survey collection, because Hayes and Blum, Alan Hayes and John Blum, created this book, and it takes you pueblo to pueblo, showing you the evolution of pottery at each pueblo over a period of time. It's a great book. There's an updated version of this book that's called the Desert Southwest. It's basically the same book. There's a lot of the same pieces that are pictured in it, and it's really educational in terms of giving you a sense of background. The Desert Southwest is not as much about potteries, but there you go. It's still got a lot of potteries pictures in it. Southwestern pottery, Anasazi to Zuni, it rocks. It's got everything, and there is, like I said, an updated version of it. Now, long before Hayes and Blum did this, and it's important to note, my bias towards this particular series of books is because it's about figural and effigy pottery to a great extent. And if you look behind me, these are pieces from Hopi. That's what I've got here as a background. And those are the pieces that I really like. And we'll talk about why in a minute. But long prior to that, you had people who were trying to convince the world, back when it wasn't so easy, that Pueblo pottery, current Pueblo pottery, was art, and that the aesthetic should be really appreciated. It was a tough sell back in the like 1960s, 1970s, because for the longest period of time it was U.S. government policy to try and obliterate all of the native nations. Children were forced to go to boarding schools. They were forbidden to speak their own languages. They had their hair cut. They couldn't engage in any of their religions. It was a dreadful period of time. So out of that, however, there were a few people, and Rick Dillingham was one, and J.J. Brody, who's a professor at the University of New Mexico, art history professor, was another. And Brody wrote the introduction to this book, but it was actually created by Rick Dillingham, and it's an expansion on a book that was called The Seven Families in Pueblo Pottery, which was an actual gallery show that was put on. I can't remember where it was put on. Maybe at UNM. I can't remember. But anyway, the little book, The Seven Families, that's nice. But this one, the 14 Families book, is the one where you're going to learn the most. It takes you through the family trees, and it tells you who the potters are that are producing all of these magnificent modern works. They show some of the older pottery as well, but to my way of thinking, not nearly enough. But just to give you an idea, this piece right here was in the Denver Art Museum, and they had a woman take over the art museum and decide that this was just not up to their standards, even though it was by Serafina Tafoya. And so she put it up for sale at Christie's auction house in New York. I flew there and bid against the head buyer of the Smithsonian to try and get it. And I went up to $6,000, and they went to $7,000, and I was done. But that just kind of gives you an idea of just the coolness of this book. Knowledge is power. If you do not study, if you do not learn, first of all, you'll be a dumbass, and you'll come across that way when people are selling to you, and so they'll try and take advantage of you. Okay? People who are ignorant tend to be victims. Just bear that in mind. There's a payoff for studying and being diligent. Okay? Rick Dillingham, unfortunately, has since passed away, but he left you a gift. And this gift of knowledge is amazing. I also recommend that you actually invest a little bit in some reference books. This one is very dry because it basically just lists different potters from the northern pueblos, the Tewa and Towa pueblos, north of Santa Fe. But it lists hundreds and hundreds of creators, gives family trees, and it gives you, if you come across a piece of pottery and it's signed, you can usually figure out who it was that signed it by having this. That can be invaluable if you're going out to thrift stores or if you're going to flea markets. Knowledge is power. That is the mantra. I learned that when I began being a collectibles dealer when I was 14 years old. All the old cigar smoking antique dealers that took the time to mentor me, oh my God, they just pounded that into my head. Knowledge is power. If you don't have a reference library, don't bother trying to buy this stuff because you're just not going to be successful. You have to put in the work. Okay, another way to get information is through this book. That's my particular bias, is Santa Clara Pueblo. I have over 10,000 pieces of Pueblo pottery, but 2,000 of them are from Eloy's Pueblo, Santa Clara. And this gives you a lot of information. It actually shows you photos of Helen Shupla firing. And it's really kind of funny because Helen married in. So she actually wasn't even born at Santa Clara, but she made some of the best Santa Clara pottery that was ever made. And so that's good. Finally, I highly encourage you to get auction catalogs and look for copies of American Indian Art magazine. They unfortunately stopped producing American Indian Art magazine about 4 years ago. But the back issues are full of knowledge. This particular one is a special on Cochiti figures, and I needed the inside of it, so this is just the cover. But here's the thing. These American Indian art magazines, the most valuable thing about them is actually the ads, not the articles inside. I mean, if I see one more article about beadwork or some other genre of Native American collecting, my eyes will roll back in my head, because only maybe 1 out of every 5 issues would actually have something that related to pottery. But every issue had ads, and some of them, like this one, on the back cover of this particular issue, show a beautiful bowl created by my friend Diego Romero. This particular bowl today would sell for about $20,000. So I'm just saying that, and you also can just learn buckets of things if you can get old auction catalogs, and then if you're really lucky, you can get what's called the prices realized. And so then you can go along in here, like I do, and weep silently at all the things that you missed out on that you really, really, really would have bought at the prices that they sold for, but they're gone, and someone else has them, and you have to now wait for them to die. And I'm pretty good at that. So, you know, being a collector and really, really wanting the cool stuff, I'm gonna speak to that just real quickly here. This piece, well, that one there. I have a bunch of pieces in here that are from a collection by a gentleman by the name of Bob Whiteside. Bob Whiteside passed away in 1999. I started collecting in 1998. Went to my first Ron Munn auction in Albuquerque, and it just ruined me, because at my first Ron Munn auction, as I went in there, they had this incredible selection of figural and effigy pottery, like this head right here, which is a canteen from Hopi, Palaka polychrome, in the shape of a human face. They didn't make many of these. In fact, this may be the only one in the world. And that's something that's really important to realize about Pueblo pottery. Every piece is unique. Even like I have some pieces by Martha Caro from Cochiti, which are very, very similar. But if you line up 6 of them, you realize that all 6 of them have their own individual characteristics. They were all handmade. So in effect, you are totally buying original art every time you buy a piece of pottery. But anyway, trying to get as many pieces as I could that were either from Bob Whiteside's collection or that would have been worthy of Whiteside's collection has been my quest over the last 22 years. And this particular piece I got out of a gallery down in Santa Fe, and it was from Whiteside's collection. But when you're buying pieces like this, be prepared to pay, because it's going to cost you monies. You can buy, you know, really nice jars like these, lidded jars, and they'll generally, well, at a gallery they'll generally cost you maybe $600 or $800. But something like this, you're talking thousands of dollars. And then you start multiplying that times a whole bunch of things like that, and you can get into some deep monies fast. A critical aspect about this that's important for you to realize is that I don't have a whole lot of monies. In fact, I've had entire years where I had to basically not buy potteries. But when things have gotten a little bit better for me, I get right back into it again. And right now things are pretty good in the comics business, so I'm buying pieces at a clip of about 1,000 a year. That in and of itself, there are very few public institutions in America that have 1,000 pieces, and almost no private collectors. I know of one. So when I'm adding at that kind of pace, my goal is to create the largest survey collection of Pueblo pottery that's available anywhere in the world, and to make it freely available to scholars to learn and study. And so on the one hand, I'm really kind of an avaricious collector, and I really, really want the stuff. But on the other hand, my avarice is only to the extent that by adding to the collection, I increase the overall breadth of knowledge that I can provide free of charge to anyone who is interested. And that, I think, is something that is good. This is sort of a strange concept, but the concept is that all of us are going to die. And when we die, pretty much we sink without a stone. Our memories last for a while, but they disappear. But sometimes we can create some good in the world. And my goal, and this video it kind of fits in with that, is to create positive benefit on every single day that I get up. And the positive benefit in this particular case is to try and get you kind of lured in a little bit into realizing that Pueblo pottery is way different than collecting anything else. When you hold an object like this, first off, as I said, there's a connection to someone else who collected before me who is now passed on. But there's also a connection to the creator themselves. And I don't know for a fact who created this, but Nampeo of Hano is a fairly good guess. And the key part is that it will pass on from me, and in all probability will not be sold, because this collection, as I accumulate it, is intended to remain after my passing and to be a legacy that I leave as a gift to the rest of the world. But it also, and this is where it gets strange, so just go with me on this. The Pueblo people consider their pottery to be actually sentient and to be more than a few potters that I've spoken to refer to their potteries as their children, and they consider them to be members of their family. And the reason they do that is because when they're hand forming pots, they have to use some type of abrasive material as a temper to keep the clay from cracking when it's firing. In the course of doing that, they end up having bits of their skin and bits of their blood that's actually imbued into the clay. Then, when they're firing, there is an almost universal belief among potters that if their heart is not in the right place, if their spirit is in the right place, if they haven't said the proper prayers, that their potteries will crack and be destroyed in the course of being fired. And so what I have here, and again, you got to kind of go with this, what I have here is as much of an orphanage for the lost children of the Pueblos as it is an actual collection in the sense of what people think of when they think of collecting material objects. These are not material objects. These are way more than that. And so if you're getting into the collecting of Pueblo pottery and you come to me, as many people have done, and you start talking to me about market values, you just lost me at the first breath. I don't sell any of my pottery. I have no intention of selling any of my pottery. I've already invested 25 years of my life and pretty much every spare cent that I had into buying pottery. And it's going to stay together. It's not going to be sold. So what we have here is something that supersedes material possession. Also, I have a firm belief, and this is something, you can call it a rationalization if you will, but it's a firm belief that all pottery that is intended to be a part of my family will come to me. I only incorporate pieces that come of their own accord. I don't push it. If I end up bidding in an auction and someone else beats me out, it's like, okay, it wasn't intended to be. But these pieces, 10,000 of them, have somehow found their way here and found their way into my lives into my life and bonded with me. I think that's kind of cool. And I think that if you start to build your own collection, you'll start to understand and feel the same things that I do. Or at least I hope you do, because it is the enriching part of all of this. It's not owning the object, it's protecting the object, because none of us actually own anything in this world. We're but guardians of things for a very temporal period. And so that's it for today. I'm going to try and do something that's a little bit more in depth, talking about different pieces of pottery in our next video. But I hope this at least gave you kind of a sense and puts you on a path towards getting maybe some reference books. The reference books will definitely start there, because before you go out there and start throwing money around, make sure that you're buying stuff that's real and that you're not ending up with things that are you know, from the Philippines or you know, were made by people who are trying to fool you into thinking you're getting the real deal. Education, you gotta have it. Knowledge is power. That's it. I'm Chuck Rozanski. This is the Pueblo Treasures Museum. I'll have my videographer, Chris, who's, God bless him, volunteering to help me with all of this. I'll have him do a little pan so you can see down some of the aisles here, and then we'll talk more about them a little bit later. Thanks, and have a good one.